Fandoms are a broad church. From your casual nerd through to cosplayers, through to your more hardcore basement dwellers, it's astounding how film and television can unite people over something as simple as the love of a programme. Trekkies, Star Wars fans, Potterheads, they all have their cliques, some are more into it than others, but you'll never find a more broader church than that of the Whovians. Indeed, as a Doctor Who fan myself, 2002 until the present day, I've seen firsthand the absolute diversity of the fandom in my time, and it's quite wonderful. Sometimes it's a bit worrying, but ultimately wonderful. Today we're going to be looking into the world of fan films. For those of you unaware of what fan films are, well, they're literally that. Films based on popular television and films produced by fans of the shows and movies. They're usually completely original, if not heavily cribbed, ideas that occur within the show's universe, but occasionally they can just be straight adaptations. For example, Raiders, which was a shot-for-shot remake of the Indiana Jones film Raiders of the Lost Ark, or in more recent times, Star Trek Continues, which attempts to continue on with the events of the original Star Trek TV show nearly 50 years after it went off air. Today's film is a fan film based on the 1968 Doctor Who story The Web of Fear. For those of you unfamiliar with Doctor Who beyond the core concept, a man in a time machine travels through time and space with a companion, trying to right wrongs and fight evil wherever he lands, this is an adaptation of a story from the original run of the TV show. The plot is almost identical to the originally broadcast version, albeit 20 minutes shorter than the full 6-part serial that it's based on. It features the Doctor and his companions, Jamie and Victoria, having just escaped from a rather nasty encounter when the Doctor's time machine, the TARDIS, becomes enveloped in a strange web-like substance. It's later revealed that central London, and it's assumed the rest of Great Britain, has been invaded by giant robot Yetis, who in particular have seized control of a large part of the London Underground. The Doctor arrives well after the invasion has taken place, and teaming up with the army and an old friend from a previous adventure, the Doctor and co must figure out what the Yetis want and try their best to defeat them, all the while battling the mysterious web-like fluid that seems to be enveloping the entire underground system. It's a bit out there as far as stories go, but it's a wonderfully eccentric story told in quite a pacey way, and it's one of my favourites of that era. The story was originally broadcast in 1968 and was stored at the BBC until 1978 or 79, when it was destroyed by the BBC in order to allow them to reuse the tape for other programming. The story remained missing for decades until in 2013 a full set was found in Africa. As a bittersweet sting, however, while the film prints were being prepared for their return, the third part of this 6-part serial was stolen and hasn't been seen since. Whether it'll ever be seen again is really quite questionable. But for this week's episode, we need to go back to a point when this story was still more or less entirely missing. Nearly 2 decades before it would be found, in fact. Australian Web of Fear, a title I affectionately call this to help differentiate it from the original version and to any other fan-made creation, was produced in 1992 thanks to a chance encounter in Newcastle, New South Wales, between two people who would go on to become long-time friends and collaborators, David Butcher and Grant Grotham. After meeting on the convention floor, the two would spend evenings watching old Doctor Who tapes together, and according to Butcher, one night in particular while watching, they came up with the idea to recreate a missing story. After much discussion, they settled on the 1968 Patrick Troughton classic The Web of Fear. as they figured it would be the most plausible and cheapest to shoot. From speaking to David Butcher, I was told that in terms of previous work, this was his first venture into filmmaking. And other than a low-budget 50-minute short, Grant hadn't really produced anything either. It was because of this that they decided to form a film company, Butchgro Films, which, if you hadn't already figured out, is a combination of the pair's last names, Butcher and Grothan. Grant took on directional and script writing duties, adapting his version of the script mainly from Terence Dix's penned Target novelisation of the story, while David oversaw actually producing the production, sourcing most of the props, performing some location scouting, and helping with casting for the production. According to Butcher, most of the costumes came from an army surplus store, and the Yeti costumes originated from a costume store and were originally bear outfits. He sourced most of the guns from a toy store, and his version of the TARDIS console is literally built out of cardboard and old VCRs. Casting for the production was fairly straightforward, as most of the cast and crew were friends or relatives of Grant's. This helped to keep the costs down, but also helped them in terms of availability, and ensuring that everyone more or less got on set. There were even some cast members who doubled up as crew members, with the actor playing Captain Knight also pulling double duty as the film's sound designer. The whole project was filmed mainly on weekends over roughly 6 to 8 months, which I thought was very impressive when you consider that this movie is just shy of 120 minutes long. And they filmed the whole thing in less than 40 days. It was produced for around $2,000 Australian, which in modern cash would be about $3,700 or approximately £2,130. The majority of the tunnel and train platform shots being captured at a nearby disused railway line, and the majority of the service duct shots being filmed in an office complex which was managed by David Butcher's father. The battle sequences and some of the establishing shots in the opening of the film were shot in and around the centre of Newcastle, and the TARDIS interior scenes were actually shot in David Butcher's front room, which if you look closely you'll spot David's sofa, which I thought was a really nice touch. Even more surprisingly, the opening scene in which one of the main scientists, Professor Travers, tries to get his Yeti back, was actually shot late at night in an actual museum, which is pretty impressive for a first film made for fun. So how is it? Well, it works perfectly well as a film unto itself in my opinion, and after the initial 10 minutes of proper sci-fi, it settles into a more than decent, pacey little adventure story. I must say that it's the cast that absolutely make this film. Everyone seems to be having fun on the project, and while the performances are mixed at best, some people properly get into the roles and others, it would seem, are reading their scripts just off camera. There's something to be enjoyed in all the performances. In particular, I have to mention the late David Russell as the Doctor, who I honestly think is my favourite non-canon adaptation of the Doctor I've ever seen. He's just so totally mellow about everything that's happening in the story, and he really seems to just take everything as it comes. He's a total contrast to Troughton's nervous and electric performance. This is probably most obvious during the "don't touch the rails" sequence. I can't show you Troughton's version, please check the link in the description to see that, but Russell's version is amazing.
Don't move, whatever you do, don't touch those rails. All right, Jamie, the electricity's off, you can relax. What's all the fuss about? I told you these were electric trains. If they'd been current in those rails, you'd be dead by now. Should be safe enough. Better not touch the rails, though. Someone might switch on again.
I also love the actor playing Jamie in this. There's a bit of unintentional humour really, as quite a lot of his dialogue is very heavily muffled. Whether this was an issue with the inbuilt microphones or whether it's because the actor didn't speak up enough is unclear. But the result is that for the majority of the film, when Jamie talks, all you hear is a muffled noise, followed by other cast members talking to him like he just spoke perfectly clearly. It's a bit like Kenny from South Park or Boomhauer in King of the Hill. And while it's unintentional, it definitely kept me watching. The actor playing Professor Travers as well is really quite entertaining, as is the actor playing the Brigadier. Both seem to really get into their roles and both seem to be absolutely enjoying themselves. I also need to point this out because it's something that sticks in my head every time I watch this movie. Some of the cast say Yeti, but some of the cast say Yeti. I'm not sure if this is an accent thing or if there was some confusion on the pronunciation of the word Yeti, but I screened this once to a group of university film students as part of an obscure cinema season, and the amount of people coming up to me afterwards to ask me about the Yeti was quite incredible. The majority of this film was shot on 8mm videotape, so the picture quality was never gonna be pristine. This version also swings wildly between black and white and oversaturated bleeding colour. I actually have difficulty deciding whether I prefer the film in black and white or not. The cinematography for this film is actually pretty solid for a first-ish attempt. Especially when you consider that this was around the time when tutorials on how to make films and internet guides simply didn't exist. This must have been a very well-planned film, and it's clear that there's real effort to try and make it look cinematic. There's also several good uses of pans, and a pretty decent mix of shots. Even some moderate experimentation, which is always welcome. It's hardly groundbreaking revolutionary stuff, but it's competent and quite pleasant to watch, which again, for an almost first attempt, is frankly amazing. The soundtrack is mainly tracks from the Seventh Doctor's era. I believe a good chunk are from the 1988 televised story Remembrance of the Daleks. But there are a couple of original compositions in there as well, and they're pretty good too. They have a decent usage throughout this film, and nothing really feels out of place. A couple of points that don't hold up as good as they possibly could for me would probably be the direction, which does seem a little bit bland in places. It doesn't really feel like the cast know entirely what's going on throughout, and more often than not it seems like they've been left to their own devices. I mean, this doesn't exactly take away from the performances, which are very entertaining, but it could maybe have been a bit tighter. The other issue is the lighting, or rather the lack of lighting. Sadly, the budget didn't stretch far enough to include set lights, which renders some of the tunnel sequences quite literally in the dark. It also means that everything has this strange pale washed out vibe. I'd say about 80% of the film is lit well enough to be visible. This film was edited together using VCRs, and as a result some of the cuts are a little imprecise. There's nothing ridiculously out of place here, but some scenes maybe hang just a little too long, or could cut just a fraction sooner. There are also fade ups and fade downs from black that are maybe a little bit too brief. But again, considering the tools they had available at the time, it's entirely forgivable that cuts aren't 100% precise. One of the side effects of editing the film using VCRs has also been that the film's quality has degraded as takes have been spliced to form the finished tape. In fact, it was only during the editing stages that it was noticed that several cast members had severe audio issues, meaning large chunks of the dialogue were either muffled or inaudible. Nevertheless, the pair struggled through the film and it was completed and eventually handed out to some friends and family members. Had this not been the case, I might not be talking to you about this movie right now. You see, one of David and Grant's friends or family members ended up dubbing their copy of the film onto another tape for one of their friends, who did the same to one of their friends, who did the same for one of their friends. And eventually the film ended up in the hands of somebody who thought this would benefit from an airing on YouTube. I ended up discovering this film in about 2012, almost 20 years since it was first recorded, and I pretty much instantly fell in love with it. It's a cheesy and clearly quite affectionately made production that seems to have real, genuine passion behind it. Yeah, it's a bit rickety in places, but that's all part of its charm. When a film like this comes from a place of such genuine honesty and care, it's a really special experience. And when you consider that this was just two blokes and their friends and family doing it for fun, it makes it all the better. This is a genuinely entertaining movie, and I compel you to dig out a copy if you can ever get your hands on one. It's a must-see, not just for Doctor Who fans, but for anybody who enjoys science fiction. I spent the best part of 4 years on and off researching this film on various message boards, trying to figure out more information about the production company, or even the people who made it. And up until 2017, I'd gotten next to nowhere. It seemed that any information about this film had slipped through the cracks of time, never to be seen again. It was only by chance that I was able to talk to David Butcher about his and Grant's work that I'm able to tell you about this film now. And if it wasn't for the kindness of the Doctor Who fan film database, I wouldn't even be able to show you this film at all. And it really pains me that the best quality version is a ropey VHS copy, because I'd love, genuinely love, to see this film in its original presentation. David has told me that in recent years, Grant has been slowly working on a digitally remastered version, transferring the raw footage onto a computer and using it to edit together a high-quality version. All I can say is, I hope to God this sees the light of day, because I'd love to see it. It's far from a perfect movie, but its imperfections are what make it as great as it is. After this film, Butchgro would go on to produce a cop movie known as The Siege, which was also made in 1992. And after that, things went quiet for a bit. But the story of Butchgro doesn't end there. Not by a long shot.